For 12 years, Esther Whitmore was the only midwife in Colorado Territory who delivered nothing but stillborn babies. Every birth she attended ended in death. Every family she served suffered tragedy, and every child she touched was declared dead upon arrival. The townspeople called her cursed, doctors refused to work with her, and grieving mothers crossed themselves when they saw her coming. But when federal agents discovered what Esther was really doing with those dead babies, they realized she hadn't delivered a single stillborn child. She had saved 284 lives. The small cemetery on the hill overlooking Willow Creek told a story that broke the heart of anyone who walked among its weathered headstones. Row after row of tiny graves marked the resting places of infants who had supposedly died at birth, their brief lives measured not in years or months, but in moments. Each small marker bore the same tragic inscription, born and called home, followed by a single date that marked both birth and death. And every single one of those graves was connected to the same woman, Esther Whitmore, the midwife who seemed to bring death instead of life. Esther was 52 years old when she first arrived in Willow Creek in 1875, carrying a worn leather medical bag and letters of recommendation for physicians in Kansas who praised her skill and dedication. She was a small, quiet woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that seemed too delicate for the harsh work of frontier medicine. Her voice was soft and soothing, the kind of voice that could calm frightened mothers during difficult labor, and she had a habit of humming old hymns while she worked that made even the most anxious families feel at peace. Colorado Territory desperately needed experienced midwives. The frontier was unforgiving to women and children, and infant mortality rates were staggering even when trained medical professionals were available to assist with births. Most settlements had no doctors at all, relying on whatever medical knowledge existed among the women of the community. The arrival of a professionally trained midwife was seen as a blessing that could save countless lives and bring hope to families who faced the terrifying prospect of childbirth without proper medical care. Esther established her practice in a small house on the outskirts of Willow Creek, converting the back room into a clean, well-equipped birthing area that was unlike anything most frontier families had ever seen. She had modern medical instruments, clean linens, and supplies of medicines that were almost impossible to obtain in remote territories. Most importantly, she had knowledge of birthing techniques and emergency procedures that could mean the difference between life and death for both mothers and babies. But from her very first case, something seemed terribly wrong with Esther's practice. Margaret Sullivan, the wife of a local rancher, had been experiencing a difficult pregnancy and called for Esther's assistance when labor began. The delivery appeared to proceed normally. Esther worked calmly and competently, providing reassurance and pain relief throughout the lengthy process. But when the baby was finally born, Esther's demeanor changed completely. After examining the newborn for several minutes in private, Esther emerged from the birthing room with tears in her eyes and the devastating news that the baby had been stillborn. Despite appearing healthy and normal, the child had somehow died during delivery. Margaret was heartbroken, and her husband was furious, demanding to know how an experienced midwife could have failed to save his child. Esther's explanation was professional but unsatisfying. She claimed that sometimes babies died during delivery for reasons that medical science couldn't predict or prevent, and that frontier conditions made infant mortality tragically common. She had done everything possible to save the child, but some tragedies were beyond human power to prevent. The Sullivan baby was buried in Willow Creek's cemetery with a simple ceremony, and Esther waived her usual fee out of respect for the family's grief. Most people assumed that the stillbirth was simply bad luck, the kind of tragedy that was all too common on the frontier. But the tragedy of the Sullivan baby was only the beginning. Over the following months, Every birth that Esther attended ended in the same heartbreaking way. Healthy pregnancies would proceed normally until delivery, when something would go mysteriously wrong and the baby would be declared stillborn. Esther's explanations were always the same: frontier conditions, unpredictable complications, and the harsh realities of life in an undeveloped territory. After 6 months of practice, Esther had attended 14 births and delivered 14 dead babies. Word began to spread throughout the territory that the new midwife was either incompetent or cursed. Some people whispered that she was deliberately killing babies, while others suggested that she had been sent by the devil to punish the community for some unnamed sin. Despite the growing suspicion and fear, desperate families continued to call for Esther's assistance. Childbirth was dangerous enough without professional help, and many women preferred to take their chances with a supposedly cursed midwife rather than face labor alone. Esther continued to provide the same careful, competent care that had earned her professional reputation in Kansas, but every birth ended in the same devastating outcome. Dr. James Morrison, Willow Creek's only physician, became increasingly concerned about Esther's practice after the first year of consistent stillbirths. Morrison was an experienced frontier doctor who had seen his share of infant mortality, but Esther's record was beyond anything that could be explained by normal medical factors. He began attending some of Esther's deliveries as an observer, hoping to identify what was going wrong and help improve outcomes. What Dr. Morrison observed only deepened the mystery surrounding Esther's practice. Her medical techniques were flawless. Her sanitary procedures were better than anything Morrison had seen on the frontier, and her care for laboring mothers was exemplary. She seemed to do everything right during delivery, yet every baby was somehow stillborn by the time she finished her work. Morrison's examinations of the stillborn infants revealed another puzzling aspect of Esther's cases. The babies appeared healthy and well-developed, with no obvious physical abnormalities that would explain their deaths. Most mysteriously, they showed none of the typical signs of stillbirth that Morrison would have expected to see. It was as if the babies had simply stopped living at the moment of birth for no apparent medical reason. As Esther's reputation for delivering stillborn babies spread throughout Colorado territory, she began attracting a different kind of clientele. Instead of local families seeking routine birthing assistance, she started receiving visits from women who traveled long distances to reach her practice. These women often arrived alone, without husbands or family members, and they seemed to have unusual stories about their pregnancies and circumstances. Some claimed to be widows whose husbands had died during their pregnancies. Others said they were traveling to join family members in distant territories. A few presented themselves as women who had been abandoned by their husbands and were seeking to start new lives elsewhere. What united all of these women was their apparent desperation and their willingness to travel hundreds of miles to reach a midwife who had never successfully delivered a living child. Dr. Morrison began to suspect that something more complex was happening with Esther's practice than simple medical incompetence or supernatural intervention. The pattern of women who traveled long distances to seek her services suggested that Esther might be providing more than just birthing assistance. Her reputation for delivering stillborn babies might actually be attracting women who wanted their babies to be declared dead for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. Morrison's suspicions were confirmed when he began investigating the backgrounds of some of Esther's clients. Several of the women who had traveled to receive her services were not who they claimed to be. Some were using false names, others had forged documents, and a few were clearly fleeing from dangerous situations that they couldn't discuss openly. The breakthrough in Morrison's investigation came when he recognized one of Esther's clients as Sarah McKenna, a woman whose husband had been killed by slave catchers in Kansas. Sarah was wanted by federal authorities for helping escape slaves, and she was clearly pregnant when she arrived at Esther's practice, claiming to be a widow seeking medical care. Morrison realized that Esther's practice was serving as a refuge for women who needed their babies to disappear from official records for their own safety and the safety of their children. The stillbirth certificates that Esther provided weren't just tragic medical documents. They were legal proof that babies had died who actually needed to vanish from their old identities and start new lives. The system that Esther had created was both simple and sophisticated. Women who were fleeing from dangerous situations would travel to her practice using false identities. Esther would deliver their babies normally, but would then provide them with official death certificates declaring the children stillborn. The mothers and babies would then be given new identities and transportation to safe locations where they could start over without fear of being discovered. The fake stillbirths served multiple purposes in protecting the mothers and children. Death certificates provided legal proof that the babies no longer existed, making it impossible for slave catchers, abusive husbands, or other threats to track them down. The certificates also explained why women who had been visibly pregnant suddenly appeared without children, preventing suspicious questions about what had happened to their babies. Esther's operation was supported by a network of allies throughout Colorado Territory and beyond who helped provide the mothers and children with new identities, safe transportation, and financial support for starting over. Many of these allies were connected to underground railroad networks that were already helping escaped slaves reach freedom. But Esther's work expanded the network's mission to include other women and children who needed to escape from dangerous situations. The babies who were supposedly buried in Willow Creek Cemetery were actually being raised by adoptive families in distant communities where their original identities would never be discovered. These families were carefully selected for their ability to provide safe, loving homes and their commitment to protecting the children's true backgrounds. The children grew up believing they had been born to their adoptive families, never knowing that their births had been officially recorded as deaths. Esther's fake death certificates were sophisticated forgeries that could withstand official scrutiny. She had access to authentic medical forms and official seals through her connections with sympathetic doctors and government officials who supported her work. The certificates were filed with territorial authorities and became part of the permanent record, providing lasting protection for the children whose deaths they documented. The scope of Esther's operation was remarkable. Over 12 years, she had helped 284 women and children disappear from their old lives and start over in safety. The women included escaped slaves fleeing to freedom, wives escaping from abusive marriages, mothers protecting children from dangerous fathers, and families threatened by criminal organizations or corrupt officials. The network that supported Esther's work had developed sophisticated methods for creating new identities and providing ongoing support for the families they helped. New birth certificates were created for the children using their adoptive families' names, giving them completely legal identities that had no connection to their original births. The mothers were provided with documents establishing their new identities as widows, spinsters, or women who had never had children. Esther's operation faced constant danger from law enforcement agencies that were actively hunting for escaped slaves and other fugitives. Federal marshals regularly patrolled Colorado Territory looking for underground railroad activities, and corrupt officials often worked directly with slave catchers and other bounty hunters who were seeking missing women and children. The challenge of maintaining her cover as a legitimate midwife while conducting rescue operations required Esther to develop extraordinary skills in deception and misdirection. She had to convince local authorities that her consistently tragic outcomes were the result of medical factors rather than deliberate activities. She also had to maintain the trust of legitimate clients who genuinely needed birthing assistance, even as she used her practice to help fugitives escape. Esther's emotional toll was enormous. She had to maintain the facade of being a failed midwife who brought death instead of life. accepting the community's fear and suspicion while knowing that she was actually saving lives. She had to participate in funeral services for babies who were actually alive and healthy, watching grieving families mourn children who were safe in distant homes. The deception became even more complex when Esther began serving legitimate clients alongside the fugitive mothers who sought her help. She had to develop methods for ensuring that real pregnancies resulted in healthy births while maintaining her reputation for delivering stillborn babies. This required careful coordination with Dr. Morrison and other allies who could provide cover for successful deliveries when necessary. Esther's solution was to establish a rotation system where legitimate clients would be referred to other medical professionals for actual deliveries, while women seeking her rescue services would receive the fake stillbirth procedures. This required extensive communication with other medical providers throughout the territory and careful scheduling to ensure that her apparent failure rate remained consistent. The crisis that would ultimately expose Esther's operation began in 1886, when federal authorities launched a comprehensive investigation of Underground Railroad activities in Colorado Territory. Agent Thomas Kane, who specialized in detecting refugee assistance networks, was assigned to investigate reports of unusual population movements and suspicious documentation patterns that suggested large-scale rescue operations were taking place. Kane's investigation methods were more sophisticated than anything Esther's network had previously encountered. Rather than simply looking for direct evidence of illegal activities, Kane analyzed statistical patterns that might reveal hidden operations. He studied birth and death records, population movements, and economic activities that could indicate systematic assistance to fugitive populations. Kane's attention was drawn to Willow Creek by the unusual mortality statistics associated with Esther's practice. The consistently high infant death rate seemed statistically impossible unless deliberate factors were involved. More suspicious still, Kane discovered that many of the mothers who had received Esther's services had subsequently disappeared from the territory without leaving forwarding addresses or information about their future plans. Kane's investigation revealed other patterns that suggested Esther's practice was more than it appeared to be. The women who sought her services often arrived in Willow Creek with no previous connections to the community and left shortly after their supposed tragedies without establishing any ongoing relationships. Financial records showed that many of these women paid for medical services with unusually large amounts of cash, suggesting they had access to resources that didn't match their claimed circumstances. Most damning of all, Kane discovered that several of the women who had supposedly lost babies to Esther's care were actually wanted fugitives who had been reported missing by law enforcement agencies in other states. The timing of their disappearances coincided perfectly with their visits to Esther's practice, suggesting that the midwife was helping them assume new identities. Kane's investigation strategy involved infiltrating Esther's network by posing as someone who could provide assistance to her operation. He presented himself as a sympathetic businessman who had connections to transportation networks and safe houses that could be useful for refugee assistance activities. His goal was to gain Esther's trust and gather evidence of her illegal activities before making arrests that would expose the entire network. But Esther had developed sophisticated security procedures during her 12 years of operation that made infiltration extremely difficult. New contacts were thoroughly investigated before being accepted into the network, and multiple layers of intermediaries protected the most sensitive aspects of her work. Kane found that gaining access to Esther's inner circle required establishing credibility over an extended period of time that made quick investigations impossible. Kane's breakthrough came when he managed to intercept communications between Esther and her network contacts that revealed details about upcoming rescue operations. The intercepted messages confirmed that Esther was providing fake death certificates for living babies and that the children were being transported to adoptive families in distant locations. Armed with evidence of Esther's activities, Kane planned a coordinated raid that would catch her in the act of providing fake medical services and hopefully capture other network members who could be prosecuted for their roles in the rescue operations. The raid was scheduled for a time when Kane's surveillance indicated that Esther was expecting a client who needed rescue services. But Kane's plans were discovered by sympathetic allies within law enforcement who had been secretly supporting Esther's work. Dr. Morrison had developed contacts among federal officials who shared his belief that Esther's rescue operations served a higher moral purpose than the laws they technically violated. These allies provided advance warning that allowed Esther to prepare for the raid. Esther faced a choice between fleeing and abandoning her network or staying to protect the women and children who depended on her services. She chose to remain in Willow Creek and face whatever consequences would result from the exposure of her work, believing that her sacrifice might provide cover for the rest of her network to continue operating. The raid on Esther's practice took place on a cold morning in November 1887, when federal agents surrounded her house and demanded entry under authority of warrants charging her with fraud, conspiracy, and interference with federal law enforcement. Kane expected to find evidence of ongoing rescue operations and hopefully capture fugitives who could be prosecuted as examples to deter others. Instead, Kane found exactly what Esther's practice appeared to be: a legitimate medical facility operated by a midwife who had experienced tragic but explainable professional failures. The birthing room contained standard medical equipment and supplies that were consistent with normal midwife practices. The records showed a pattern of stillbirths that, while unusual, could be attributed to the harsh conditions and limited medical resources available on the frontier. Kane searched every room in Esther's house, looking for hidden compartments, secret documents, or evidence of the fake death certificates that his surveillance had suggested she was providing. But Esther had anticipated the possibility of a raid and had carefully removed any materials that could serve as evidence of her rescue activities. Frustrated but not defeated, Kane arrested Esther on charges of medical fraud and conspiracy, hoping that prosecution would pressure her to reveal information about her network and provide evidence that could be used to arrest other members. But Esther refused to cooperate with investigators, maintaining that she was simply an unlucky midwife who had experienced an unusual number of professional tragedies. The trial of Esther Whitmore became a sensation throughout Colorado Territory as federal prosecutors struggled to prove that a respected medical professional was guilty of elaborate criminal conspiracies. The prosecution's case was based largely on statistical analysis and suspicious patterns that suggested deliberate activities, but they had no direct evidence of fake death certificates or rescued children. Esther's defense was led by sympathetic attorneys who argued that she was being persecuted for professional failures that were actually the result of frontier conditions and limited medical resources. They presented testimony from medical experts who explained that high infant mortality rates were tragically common in undeveloped territories, and that Esther's record, while unusual, was not impossible under the circumstances. The defense was also supported by testimony from women throughout the territory who praised Esther's skill, compassion, and dedication to providing medical care under difficult conditions. Many of these witnesses were actually members of Esther's rescue network, but their testimony appeared to be simple character references from grateful patients. The trial lasted for 6 weeks, and the jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The federal prosecutors had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Esther had committed the crime she was accused of, and the jury had been convinced by testimony about her good character and medical competence. But Esther's acquittal came at a tremendous cost. Her rescue network had been completely exposed, even if it couldn't be proven in court. Federal agents would continue to monitor activities throughout the territory, making it impossible for her to resume her rescue operations. Most importantly, The publicity surrounding her trial had made it dangerous for the women and children she had helped to remain in their new identities. However, the techniques that Esther had developed for creating fake death certificates and establishing new identities proved to be so effective that they were adopted by rescue networks throughout the country. Her innovations had created methods for helping fugitives that were nearly impossible for authorities to detect or counter, and her work contributed to the successful rescue of thousands of additional people in later years. Esther herself never returned to practicing midwifery after her trial. The experience had been too dangerous, and the federal government continued to monitor anyone suspected of Underground Railroad activities. Instead, she quietly moved to a distant territory where she established a new identity and spent her remaining years teaching school in a small farming community. But the impact of Esther's work extended far beyond the immediate assistance she had provided to 284 women and children. The babies who had been officially declared dead, but who were actually alive and healthy, grew up to become productive members of their adoptive communities. Many of them eventually learned the truth about their origins and became advocates for human rights and social justice causes. The mothers who had been given new identities through Esther's network established themselves in their new communities and often became leaders in efforts to help other women and children facing dangerous situations. Their success demonstrated that people could overcome even the most difficult circumstances when they were given the opportunity to start over in safety. Esther's story also contributed to growing public awareness of the moral complexities surrounding fugitive assistance laws and the enforcement of policies that criminalized efforts to help escaped slaves and other victims of persecution. Her trial had forced the territory to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between legal obligations and moral imperatives. Dr. Morrison continued to serve the medical needs of Willow Creek for many years after Esther's trial, but he never forgot the lessons he had learned about the courage required to serve causes that transcended legal boundaries. He became an advocate for medical professionals who believed their primary obligation was to preserve life and relieve suffering, regardless of the legal complications that such commitments might create. The cemetery on the hill overlooking Willow Creek still contains the small graves that mark the supposed deaths of 284 babies who had actually lived to grow up in safety and freedom. The headstones serve as a monument to one of the most successful rescue operations in American history, though few visitors understand the true story they represent. Years later, when slavery was abolished and the Underground Railroad networks were no longer needed, some of the children who had been buried in Willow Creek's cemetery returned to visit the graves that marked their official deaths. They came to honor the woman who had given them life by declaring them dead, and to ensure that Esther Whitmore's story would not be forgotten. Esther Whitmore died in 1923 at the age of 100, having lived to see the end of slavery and the vindication of the principles that had motivated her rescue work. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people who traveled from across the country to pay their respects, including many whose connection to the elderly former schoolteacher was never fully explained to other mourners. Among the mourners were middle-aged men and women who had been among the 284 babies supposedly delivered stillborn by the midwife, who delivered only dead babies. They came to honor the woman who had saved their lives by officially ending them, and to ensure that her legacy of courage and compassion would continue to inspire others. The midwife who had been cursed by her community for bringing only death had actually been blessed with the opportunity to bring life to those who needed it most. Her stillborn babies had grown up to become teachers, farmers, business owners, and community leaders who carried forward the values of courage and compassion that had made their lives possible. Esther's story remains a testament to the power of individual conscience to triumph over unjust laws, and to the extraordinary lengths that ordinary people will go to protect innocent lives. She proved that sometimes the greatest act of life is to embrace the appearance of death, and that true healing sometimes requires the courage to be misunderstood by those who cannot see beyond appearances to the deeper truths that motivate human action.